Okay, so we've been studying now for 4 weeks in the book of Psalms concerning this unit entitled When Emotions Rise. And we've studied grief and fear. And last Sunday, the lesson on the birth of Jesus Christ was about joy. And so this Sunday, the title of the lesson is Redirecting Anger. And it comes from Psalms 35, so let me flip over there right quick, verses 1 through 3 to start with, and then verses 13 to 18 after that. And so let's begin then, Psalm 35, verses 1 through 3, and let's study this lesson, Redirecting Anger. Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of shield and buckler, and stand up for my help. Also draw out the spear, and stop those who pursue me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation. So this psalm is ascribed to David. And so we first notice that David is praying this prayer with great emotion and great urgency. And so it's not clear if David has been maligned personally and requires vindication, or he wants vindication, or if this is something of national significance. And so I will take the position that it is personal, because the prayer expresses feelings that we can certainly relate to, right? When some injustice has been done to us and we get angry. All right, so the whole point of the lesson is the fact that godly people have gotten angry. Jesus got angry. And it's what you do. We get angry about some injustice that's been done to us, or we get angry about some injustice that's done to somebody else, and we get angry about it. But see, that's not wrong, because you need to recognize an injustice. It's what we do and what we say that gets us in trouble. And so there's a difference there, right? And so we can certainly relate then to this prayer because all of us have suffered some injustice that's been either done to us personally or someone in our family. In verse 1, David boldly opens his case with an appeal to God's justice. And so the verb contend there means to plead. And it's actually a legal term and could actually be translated attack. And so instead of contend or plead. So David is praying, here's what David is praying. He's praying, Lord, attack those who are fighting against me. Attack those who have done this injustice to me. So in verse 2 says, take hold of shield and buckler. So here's a picture, right? The shield was the large protective device that covered most of the body. And so this large shield was used for long-range protection from arrows. And so you can get this mental picture of this shield that was head to foot in size and as wide as a human body. And if archers were shooting at you, then you could hold the shield up and protect your whole body. Now the buckler was a small shield, and it was typically worn on the forearm. And so that was used for close combat, hand-to-hand combat with swords and knives. And that particular shield not only could be used to shield something, but it could be used as a weapon too, to hit somebody with it. It could be used quite effectively by those old soldiers. So these are mentioned first because David's praying for protection or for defense. And so that is his adversary, or adversaries are the aggressors. And so he's on the defensive. And so he uses these images then of the shield and the buckler. And so this could have been when David was a fugitive and Saul was hunting him. And so I think there's enough evidence that I could say that pretty safely, but it doesn't exactly say that in our text. Now, verse 3 says, draw out the spear also. And the spear now was an offensive weapon. And he says, say unto my soul, I am thy salvation. So David is saying, comfort my soul with the reassurance that you have always been my shield, you have always been my salvation, and you always will be. And so David is saying, you know, I've been done wrong. I want you to attack them, and I want you to defend me and shield me like you always have done. But the image of the spear there is to be take the offensive as well. All right. So this is David's prayer now, because he's been done an injustice. He's angry, and so it's not deliverance from the immediate danger. That's not meant here, but rather support and help in all the dangers and all the troubles of life. So that's the takeaway message in this prayer. So these three verses, then taken together, give us this image of the Lord representing David as counselor and protector. But the metaphor of a lawsuit also is in there, and it changes from that to a military one. And so then the Lord is likened then to a warrior who contends on David's behalf. And so that's the mental picture we get there. And so the Lord's pictured coming with a large shield and a small shield and a spear, symbolizing God's readiness then to defend David. All right, so taken all together, what do we take away from this? David's angry. An injustice has been done. And so first thing I want to point out is getting angry is not wrong. It's certainly not wrong. You know, Jesus got angry. And but what did David do? David is praying. And, you know, he's talking to God just like you would talk to a close friend or your spouse. He's talking to God. And so he's taking this matter to God. Now, what David is specifically wanting God to do may not be exactly what God's will is, but like I said, David is praying to God. He's spilling his heart out, and he's taking his petitions to God, and nothing wrong with that. But the point here is, instead of David saying something or doing something, he's taking that matter to God. Now that's the important part. He took the matter to God, and he asked God to be his counsel. He asked God to be his defense, and he's asking God also to be his offense. And so, you know, we all get angry, and that's not sinful. It's the bad choices that we make that brings on the sin, because we invariably let our emotions get ahead of us. We get angry. Some injustice has been done to us or somebody else. And, you know, maybe somebody kicked your dog, and it's what we say or do before we think about it, before we even pray about it. Take it to God first, because you never have to apologize for something you said or done. And a lot of times those things we say or do are stupid. And so you never have to apologize for something stupid that you say or do. You always take it to God first. So that's really the take home. You know, we'll say too much and we'll do too much. And so let's remember that patience is a real critical value or virtue here. And I may have more to say about that later. Now, verses 13 to 18. So I'll go ahead and read those, and then we'll take them like verse by verse. But as for me, when they were sick, my clothing was sackcloth. I humbled myself with fasting, and my prayer would return to my own heart. I paced about as though he were my friend or brother. I bowed down heavily as one who mourns for his mother. But in my adversity, they rejoiced and gathered together. Attackers gathered against me, and I did not know it. They tore at me and did not cease. With ungodly mockers at feast, they gnashed at me with their teeth. Lord, how long will you look on? Rescue me from their destructions, my precious life from the lions. I will give you thanks in the great congregation. I will praise you among the people. All right. Now, verse 13 says that when my enemy was sick, I put on sackcloth. In other words, he's talking to God now. He's pouring out his heart. He said, you know, I was grief stricken when they were sick. You know, that was my heart. He said, you know, and I humbled my soul with fasting. You know, that was another Oriental custom of showing grief. And he goes on to say, and my prayer returned into my own bosom. Now, I think what David is saying is this. You know, I prayed for them whether or not my prayers benefited them or not, I don't know, but I was praying for them. And here's another good point. What you're praying for may not benefit them at all, or the person you're praying for, or the person maybe you prayed against. It may have no impact on them at all. But guess what? It'll benefit you. And so, point again, you take those matters to God and you pray about it, because the prayers David's saying is these prayers benefited me, if not them. And so we learn, right? We're to pray for those who have caused us injustice. That is what the Christian response is. You pray for those who have despitefully used you, right? And have taken advantage of you, have done some injustice. Pray for those who you're angry with. That friend, that neighbor, that family member, in-laws, outlaws, and they may not benefit from your prayer, but that's God's business. You leave that up to God. And if we get tangled up in it, our anger is going to cause more trouble and more grief. We're going to say too much and we're going to do too much. But praying for them will benefit you. There's no doubt about that. That's biblical. That's godly. All right. Now, verse 14 says that David carried on as if they were like a close friend or a brother or a sister, and David trusted his heart with them, is what he said. And in modern terms, we would say that we trusted our inner most secrets with that friend or that family member, secrets that they could use for blackmail, basically. We were that close and personal to them, sharing our heart. And then verse 14 goes on to say that he felt the pain and the grief of every case and every instance as though it were like the loss or the death of a mother. He says, I bow down heavily. And so David is making a case for his sincerity and his innocence here. And so let me point out here is that when these things happen and we get angry, you be sure that it happened to you and not you didn't do it to them. Yeah, that's right. And that's the way that ought to play. All right? And so in every case and instance, David is saying that he acted like it was as bad as a loss of a mother. And he bowed down heavily. And so he's making a case then for his sincerity and his innocence. All right? So point here is if an injustice is done, and it's going to happen, better off that they done it and not you done it. All right? And so you can't help but to remember Job's friends, right? David, in verse 15, David said, when I needed their support, they turned on me. Yeah, they betrayed me. So we remember Job's friends, right? Job was innocent, but God was testing his faith. And boy, books can be written on that, right? God was testing Job, and here's why I think. Because Job was counted worthy. That's right. Job was counted worthy. He didn't lose his faith. Sure, he went through some dark period there, and he had questions on his mind. He did the why, but he never neglected God or turned his back on God. So Job's faith was tested, and your faith will be tested too, and my faith will be tested. And so when his friends showed up to comfort him, they turned on him and said, you're guilty of some secret sin, and this is why this is happening to you. Listen, that wasn't helpful. So a good sidebar here is you got friends that are troubled and some kind of grief, whatever. Don't go over there and make accusations. Just go over there and be supportive. So Job's friends were not helpful, and it seems common in our day that when a person falls, they get into some trouble or injustice done, whatever, and they fall from some high position, and some misfortune happens, and the crowd, turns against that person, and then they start scoffing and jeering and actually being gleeful. And some of those that jumped on me, I didn't even know them, is what David is saying here. And so here's the message here. Are you one of them kind? I hope not. You know, and if so, shame on you. Verse 16. He talks about ungodly mockers, or hypocritical mockers is maybe a better translation. And so this is the picture of an irreverent, vulgar person sitting at the table of a rich man, enjoying the feast, but hating the guest. That's the epitome of hypocrisy, right? And so this is the picture that this is painting that David is saying here. And he says, they gnashed their teeth at me. And so they spoke angrily at me, is what David is saying. You know, they were like a dog snarling at me. And so, you know, total hypocrisy. And so David is painting a picture here. You know, I'm innocent in all this. You know, I've been doing good. I've been grieving when they were grieving and praying for them. And now an injustice has happened to me. And, you know, they're piling on me. They're piling on. So taking verses 13 and 16 together, we see that David is angry because he feels betrayed by those he's done good to. Now, has that ever happened to you? Oh yeah. Some folks, you can't be good enough to them, right? And you be good, you're good, and you're good, and next thing you know, they've turned on you. You know, that makes you angry. But what are you going to do? Are you going to say too much? Or are you going to do too much? Because all that's going to do is cause bigger heartaches. Listen, it is tough. Been there, done that, to take the high road. But it's always the best road. All right? He says, I've done good deeds in my past, and now they've turned on me. And so we can relate to that. You know, David says, I've shown concern for the misery or the affliction of others. He said, he said is, I wore sackcloth. That's in verse 13. He said, I wept. That's in verse 14. I wept with them. And he talked about, in verse 13, fasting on account of their misery. And number 4, in verse 13 as well, he said, I prayed for them. So there was 4 examples there that David give that how he was showing concern for their misery and their affliction, but yet they've turned on him. So that's why he's angry. And so he did all this only to find out that those who he thought were his friends or intimate family members have turned out to be unreliable friends or unreliable family members. He said, and I've done nothing. He said, I've done nothing to cause this kind of treatment. And so there again, that's something we can relate to, right? And I think everybody could tell their story. Now, verse 17, he says, how long, Lord, will you observe that behavior? And so this is a real common cry, right, of someone that's suffering. You know, Job said it in Job 19, verse 2. And the saints in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 10, you know, they said it. How long, Lord, are you going to let this go on? How long have I got to suffer this injustice before you do something? And so it's perfectly fine to talk to God just like you were talking to your spouse or best friend and share your heart. But you always take it to God first. And God will give you wise counsel. But you be studied up and prayed up and be ready to listen to what God's got to say. And so it's a part of our sinful human nature, you know, that we recognize these injustices and we want God to do something on our behalf. And but you know, wanting God to do things that for vengeance or revenge is not our. We pray those things, but God may not be listening too close to that. I mean, we're not going to command or demand God do anything. The point here is it's a prayer. It's a sincere prayer. You're sharing your heart, and we'll let God decide. Let God direct us in how we should react, because you don't want to say too much and you don't want to do too much. So it's a part of our sinful human nature that we don't. We want God to do stuff, and it may not be in God's perfect timing or His perfect will. You leave that up to God. You know, another thing is, it's also a part of our sinful nature here that we don't recognize the discipline of suffering. Oh, yeah. Particularly when we believe we don't deserve it. And so here is in these times of being angry and we're suffering, we don't think we deserve it. You know, it may be a time of testing or a time of showing that we need to practice some more patience, all right? So we forget the precepts and the principles of the Bible that teach us that we must suffer before you can wear a crown. There's always a cross before there's a crown. And so if there's no suffering, there's no payment, then there's no reward. You know, in the world of athletics, Paul used these examples a lot, right? You know, in those days, those games were all about mostly physical stuff, right? Running and shooting your bow and arrow and things that in those days were real critical. And so nobody trains to run a marathon, 26 miles, and the marathon is tomorrow and you start training last week. No. There's lots of payment. There's lots of suffering. And on he went and used boxing and running and things like that, where there's always the payment, right? There's always suffering first, then crown. So the point here, or the picture here, is that suffering always comes before a crown. And so you may be suffering, but there's a crown there somewhere. And so we've got to learn to be patient and wait on God, all right? And so all athletes win a crown eventually, but first there's the payment, right? The suffering, the agony of the intense training. So mankind, though, desires immediate deliverance, right? And that's what David's asking for here, immediate deliverance. But the Bible says in James 1:4 that God can delay His deliverance. And He will delay His deliverance until patience has had her perfect work. That's James chapter 1 and verse 4, or its complete work. And so just remember, some injustice has happened and you're angry about it. Don't say too much. Don't do too much. You take that to God in prayer. And because God may be saying you need to suffer some here, there'll be a crown later, as long as you don't mess it up. And need to learn some patience. So let's don't forget that there's some other biblical virtues here. And so David wants or prays immediate deliverance, and which is certainly okay to pray for. But we also must consider that it's all about God's timing, right? Leave it up to God. Leave it up to God. I'm telling you, the high road is always the best road. God's way is always the best road. And that's why we study the Bible, right? We want to know what God thinks. And if we want to know what God thinks, you read about Him. Read about Him, all right? So verse 18. And so this verse may seem that David is saying, Lord, when are you going to deliver me? And then I'll give you thanks. Did you get that? He said, I will give you thanks in the great congregation. I will praise you among the people. So the way that's written is, Lord, you delivered me out of this, then I thank you. I mean, this is David's heart now, and he's talking to God, and we should do that. And so nothing wrong with that. But God's probably saying to David, let's look at this in another way. And you need to be a little more patient there, right? And so this is the idea that he's trying to induce God then to grant his request for deliverance and do it quickly. And so, that doesn't sit real well with me, but like I said, this is David's prayer. And so David is no more perfect than any of us, even though he was a man after God's own heart. We know that David had his failures, and we all do. And so the very minute though you start pointing your finger at somebody, you just remember there's three fingers pointing back, all right? So he was a man after God's own heart. Certainly he wasn't perfect. So I believe what David is saying is this. David knows that God is the master of the universe, that all things are in his control, and nothing escapes his notice. God is aware. Listen, God is aware that you're angry. He is aware that some injustice has been done. And so David is expressing his hope in God's ultimate faithfulness. And to this end, and he appeals to the Lord for deliverance so that when God does deliver him, he will, David, will proclaim it publicly, and shouldn't we as well, that God is mighty and that his works are mighty. And all about God's way, God's timing, and do it God's way. Now, let's make a few comments then before we close. First point here is in assurance of salvation. Point number 1. In verse 3, the Bible says, "Say unto my soul, I am your salvation." Now that's a pretty ambitious request, right? The Creator, the Preserver of all mankind, the Almighty, the Eternal, the Infinite God. And David said, "Speak to me and tell me that you are mine." That's sweet. That's just plain sweet. David says, and we can all claim this, God will be my salvation, and he will assure me of that. God is our salvation, and that we are sure of that, and that he assures us of that. Now that's peace. Now that's a peace that passes all understanding. Even when you're angry, there's another emotion there. That's peace. And so that's a peace that passes all understanding, right? That's joy. That's joy unspeakable, and no matter the circumstances of our life. So this is the lesson we have to learn. Lesson learned to learn. Point number 2. This psalm is a prayer of a sinner to his God. And so whatever the injustice we can feel has been done to us, we may tell it to him, just like we want to, just like we feel it, and ask of him what we desire. But we also have to remember that he is a loving friend. He will not betray us. He's not going to tell on you. He's not going to tell your secrets. But he's also going to do the right thing. And he's going to instruct you to do the right thing. And so you take it to him, right? And you leave it with him too. And so if there's any chance of you being misunderstood, you take it to God first. All right? Good deal. And if we were wrong in our prayer, then God's going to show us. And God is going to answer our prayer in his own way, in his own time. And won't we be exceedingly abundantly joyful that we did it his way and not our way. At the time, it's suffering, right? I mean, it's painful. Suffering first, crown comes. You do what's right. Take God's advice. It's written right in here. Take it to him in prayer. Take his advice. And it's going to work out a whole lot better than if you say too much or do too much. So we leave the justice in God's hands. All right? You pray for those persons that's mistreated you, and you leave that up to God. Because if you mess it up, it's just going to get bigger and worse. Last word. Be patient under injustice. Be patient in injustice. I know it's tough. Been there, done that. We all have, right? We all got our stories. Forgive your enemies. They may not forgive you. They may not ever apologize. They hurt you. They know it and you know it. They may not ever apologize. All right? That's between them and God. Don't you mess that up. Don't go messing and stirring in that. You leave the justice in God's hand. Be patient under justice. Forgive your enemies. Pray for those that despitefully use you and persecute you. Last sentence. Listen now. But be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. And that's a whole other Sunday school lesson.